Hello athletes, this is Travis back for another training talk, and for the discussion topic today we are going to talk about cross training and the relative benefits and dangers of cross training. And I think that people talk a lot about the benefits of cross training and they don't really talk or address the dangers of cross training, and particularly the dangers of getting injured during cross training. And that's the last thing we really want to do when you're training in sports other than your primary sport, is get injured and not be able to kind of compete in the activity that you are focused on in the first place. But before diving into that subject, I did want to kind of take a moment out of this and to make sure that you guys knew, especially the rowers out there, knew about my other educational channel, Rowing Resource. And that is a product I launched probably a little over a year ago now. And that is focused a lot more on kind of coaching education and education for coaches as well as program administrators. But there's a lot of great content in there for athletes as well. And so if you haven't checked that out, please, you can search Rowing Resource. It is a podcast and there's a lot of content on YouTube for that as well. And then also, to make a pitch, if you're watching these videos and they're really helping and you want to contribute to kind of help me produce more, please take a look at the Patreon page for Rowing Resource. So that was very much set up kind of as a service where people can kind of contribute to it. But now that I'm really putting a lot of my energy and effort into these talks, I certainly don't want to stop you guys from kind of contributing on a financial side if you are getting benefit and you feel like you would like to give back in that way. So you can go on to Patreon, find Rowing Resource on there, and you can sign up as a subscriber there, because ultimately this is all kind of rowing education for me. But my channel is a little bit more kind of raw, uncut conversations, whereas Rowing Resource has a little bit more polished editing involved with it. But with that taken care of, let's dive into the subject at hand. So cross training. So the benefits of cross training, we'll go over those first, all right? So the benefits of cross training, I think a lot of people are familiar with, but I think that there's some things, especially for rowers, that people don't consider when they're cross training. And I think the primary motivation for a lot of people when they are cross training is a psychological benefit. That they're trying to just mix things up and keep some variation so that they're not getting burned out mentally doing the same thing day after day throughout their season and throughout their training cycle. And so, you know, if you're a rower like myself, hopping on a bike or going for a run kind of gives a little bit of variety and mixes it up. And that mental component really can't be underestimated in terms of keeping an athlete fresh and focused and engaged. But you might also be doing it because there are training benefits that you can get from one sport that you can't necessarily get for another. And so certainly taking rowing and supplementing that with cycling would be a good example. So cycling is a sport where you're really going to benefit from training kind of at low end intensities for really long periods of time to really develop your body's ability to work and develop that low end aerobic system where it's going to be drawing on your fats primarily for fuel, and putting in those kind of volumes and that kind of time is just not practical for rowing. For running is a sport where you have to support your body weight, and rowing and cycling are sports, or swimming are sports where you're not supporting your body weight through that activity. And so adding running to your training program for any of those other sports is going to help just in terms of strengthening your bone structure, you know, because you're putting a different kind of stress on it and you're requiring it to kind of adapt a little bit more effectively to a greater than normal strain. And so running is good in that sense. I like to, with my athletes, incorporate a lot of lateral motion in their cross training. And so, you know, things like, you know, ultimate frisbee, you know, maybe a pickup game of basketball or soccer. I used to love racquetball back in the day, but don't even really know where there's racquetball courts around or other people I could play with. But those are all activities that require a lot of lateral movement, and especially for endurance athletes where you're looking at going straight for enormous amounts of time and you're always going straight. It's very linear. The muscles that you're developing are being developed in that linear pattern. That all of those kind of supportive tissues and all those you know, those tendons, those ligaments, the other muscles that kind of help you move in a lateral fashion, they're not getting developed while those primary movers are. And if you allow that to go on too long, you're really putting yourself in a really vulnerable position for injury. And so it's a good idea to, on a regular basis, just kind of train lateral motion. All right, you could go do free running or do whatever it might be, in order to just make it interesting. So find anything that just allows you to kind of move and pivot and turn, and that is a great segue into the next part, which is the dangers of cross training. And this is what I think a lot of people don't talk about. And the dangers of cross training tie directly into the benefits that you're trying to get from cross training. All right, so you're trying to get those benefits to avoid either mental burnout or physical injury, all right, from other muscles that you don't typically use in your sport, or for overdeveloping the muscles you're using in a sport. So then it makes sense that if you hop into an activity and you start using those muscles and you're not used to using those muscles, then you're at a high risk of injuring yourself, all right? Especially for the competitive athlete or someone who isn't constantly doing a lot of different motions and constantly using different cross-training mediums. Then when you do hop in and you suddenly start doing it, you're bringing a significant level of fitness into that activity. All right, so if you take an elite cyclist, an elite rower, and they hop in, not even elite, if you're just a highly competitive athlete and you're training 5+ hours a week, much less if you're training 12, 15, 20 hours a week in your chosen sport, then you are an extremely fit athlete, and your ability to produce energy for extended periods of time and produce high levels of energy for a longer period of time is very well trained. And so if you bring that degree of fitness into an activity that your muscles and your ligaments, your tendons, all those connective tissues, and your non-sport specific muscles aren't conditioned to, that is a recipe for injury and disaster, all right? Because your mental capacity, your physical, your aerobic capacity, even your anaerobic capacity to push beyond your thresholds of comfort is very high, but you are not conditioned for those motions. And so that for me, when I'm having my athletes do, or if I'm personally doing cross-training activities that I'm not used to doing, you must approach that from a purely recreational, a very relaxed perspective, which is hard if you take a bunch of competitive athletes and you give them a soccer ball and throw them on a soccer field. They're going to want to be competitive, all right? But they're also going to probably get injured if they bring the same level of intensity of their primary sport into that brand new activity. And so you have to kind of have a maturity and a patience when you're doing those cross-training activities that you're really, it is your play time, all right? Don't think of it so much as your training time, all right? It is your play time. It's there to have fun. Just imagine kind of going into that soccer game like you're playing with a bunch of 10-year-old kids, all right? Instead of a bunch of, either older teenagers or adults or whatever it may be. And so you approach it with the appropriate level of restraint, all right? You're going there to enjoy the activity, to move around, to have fun. It is play, all right? And if you don't take that approach, then you're just gonna increase your chance of getting injured in that activity. And from the rowing side, as a rower, people really need to understand and embrace the idea that on the water rowing and indoor rowing are different activities, all right? And so it is so easy for us to embrace because rowing machine manufacturers have done such a wonderful job simulating the rowing stroke on the indoor training devices that are available on the market, that we just try to think of them interchangeably. And certainly, there's the idea that, just because you can do something on the erg, you can't do it on the water. But when people talk about that, they're really just talking about your technique on the water in an unstable environment, using an oar to manipulate your resistance and to propel your boat forward and moving in sequence and time with other people. But they're not thinking about it in the sense of the erg is not the same as in the boat. In a sense of there are different muscles used throughout that stroke cycle, all right? So holding holding a fixed bar that travels, in the same relative position to your chest and torso through the stroke is going to use a lot different muscles kind of in the upper body and your intercostals and your ribs, in your back, and your obliques, then are going to be utilized at the various phases of the stroke cycle, whether that stroke cycle is sweep, where you're drawing through and you're coming through an angle, or sculling where you're out, and you're extending, you're taking the load here and then you're finishing with the load there. All right. So if you've been training a lot on the water and then you're shifting into the training cycle for the winter, if you live in a colder climate, you have to have an appreciation for the fact that you're transitioning to a cross-training medium that is very close to your primary goal, your primary training medium, but it is different, all right? And so you have to approach that with the same kind of level of caution, and you have to give your body a couple weeks to adapt and condition to that other activity before you can really approach it with the same kind of volume and intensity that you were doing on the water, and vice versa. As you're transitioning from training through the winter on the erg to training back on the water again in the spring, you have to have that transition period. And fortunately, that's less of an issue because the transition to the water also has a large technical component, and so people tend to naturally take things a little bit easier transitioning onto the water because they've got to get used to that additional challenge of moving in a boat, and in that water in an unstable environment, using the oars, rowing with other people, and so that provides a little bit more natural transition. But certainly coming from in the fall to the winter, transitioning from being on the water to being on land, where the technique isn't as critical, then you're in a lot more danger for getting injured. So those are kind of my my big takeaways, my big warnings, strengths and benefits of cross training. And as a final kind of note, I will say that especially for myself of being a rower, where the technique is so dominant in terms of what is on your mind and what is considered in your training program because of the technical demands of rowing on the water, that you need to understand that every other sport has a similar technical demands. And so whereas in rowing, if you don't have a basic level of mastery, you're not even going to stay upright in the boat, much less have a good rowing experience in the boat. In other sports, it's not as cataclysmic. If you have poor running form, you're not going to fall on your face. If you have poor cycling form, you're not going to fall over and crash. If you have poor swimming form, you're not going to drown, all right? And so it's not as immediately, there's not that kind of immediate punishment in those other sports for having poor technique, but having poor technique in those other sports brings just as much risk for injury as it does in rowing. And so if you are if you are running and you're not a trained runner, if you're cycling and you're not a trained cyclist, if you're going into swimming, you're not a trained swimmer, then you need to take the responsibility to do the research and to learn what the fundamental techniques are for those various activities. All right, for running, you need to make sure that you're not a heel striker. You need to make sure that you're running on the mid to fore of your foot and that you're adapting your technique appropriately. You need to make sure that you're wearing appropriate footwear, which is not as much padding as you can and as much kind of inserts and insoles to your shoes to kind of facilitate your horrible running technique. You need to make sure that you're standing, you got nice tall posture, your shoulders are over your hips in running. As you go, you need to make sure that your cadence is in the range it should be. If you're running with a cadence of 150, 160, then you're going to be putting a lot of pounding on your knees, much less if you're lower than that. So you need to be hitting in that 180 range for cadence. For cycling, similar concerns. For cycling, you need to make sure that your equipment is set properly. You need to make sure your seat is set appropriately in the forward and back. You need to make sure that you've got the right height of the seats as you go through that stroke cycle. You need to make sure that your seat is set appropriately relative to your handlebars. There is a lot of consideration there in setting that equipment to facilitate good execution of that cycling stroke. For the cadence again, for the cadence of cycling, you need to keep that cadence up. You need to keep it in that, 170 at least, but probably preferably in that 180 to 185, especially if you're a lightweight rower, maybe closer to the 170, 180 if you're heavyweight, but it needs to be quick. You don't want to just sit there and kind of try to pound a 150 cadence. I don't have experience in swimming, so I can't say what you need to do, what you don't need to do. Clearly, you need to learn how to breathe properly to kind of train. So there's a lot of technical considerations in those other sports that you're training, that you're cross-training in, that you need to do a little bit of research. And you're on YouTube right now, and so you're already aware of this amazing resource that YouTube is, and so use that, because there's similar videos to this and even much better produced videos, professional level videos on running, cycling, swimming technique and training methodologies. So do a cursory search for those activities, and it'll help. And I just gave you, for rowing, cycling, what kind of some of those core training components are. So you can look for running, look at getting rid of heel striking, look at a running landing on the middle to the front of your foot. Look up talks about cadence, talks about running posture, look up things about pulling instead of pushing for running. All right, so that is you're pulling your foot up and around instead of pushing back on your foot and then coming back around. All these things, all these considerations are important for effectively using these other activities to augment and supplement your training as a rower, if you're a rower. And then conversely, if you're hopping onto the indoor rowing machine, or you have the fortune to hop in a boat to cross-train for one of those other sports, then there's a lot to it, all right? And while a lot of people that are just focused on the indoor, they might kind of dispel a lot of the input that they get from the rowing community, because let's be honest here, a lot of the rowing community is kind of pompous assholes, and when they're talking to other people about their rowing, they come off very pretentious, and please ignore those people. They don't represent kind of the core spirit of the sport. But there's a lot of us out there that want everybody, indoor rower, on the water rower alike, to train effectively and to use a technique that is going to keep them safe in their training, safe from injury, and to maximize the efficacy of the meters that you're logging in on that indoor rower. And there are videos out there that can do that. And maybe I'll link some in the description for rowing that I think are really good, kind of basic technique videos for rowing. But for channels for rowing, certainly we talk more kind of in the theory on my channel, but you can find Aram Training is awesome. He does a great job. Decent Rowing does a wonderful job. Both those channels are solid picks for resources for rowing and for improving your technique, so check them out if you haven't already. But that's it. I really hope this helped you guys. So as always, subscribe if you are not already and you enjoy this content and want more like this. Put a comment below if you have questions. I'm guessing this conversation topic could generate a lot of questions, comments, so put that below and I'll answer as best as I can. Give the video a like if it helped, and share it with any of your friends or peers in the athletic community that you think might benefit from these conversation topics. And that's it. This is Travis signing off.